may hear on the news from time to time that wildfires are becoming more intense or larger or more widespread. And this is due to a lot of things, changes in regards to climate change, land management, etc. But are there ways that we can actually make our communities and cities and ecosystems more resistant and more resilient to fires? Well, today I got to sit down with Dr. Rebecca Flitcroft from the U.S. Forest Service, who is an expert in fire resistance and resilience, which who knew that was a field of study, but it is hers. And so she sat down with us today to talk about all things fire, what's happening, why, and how we can make our communities more resistant to it. So let's jump into the conversation. I will say this is like one of my favorites so far. I know I haven't done that many interviews so far, but well, I've pre-filmed a lot you guys haven't seen yet, but this is one of my favorites. She was really fun to talk to and explain things so simply. Anyway, let's jump in, starting with an introduction. Who is Rebecca Flitcroft?
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation to be here with you today. I'm Dr. Rebecca Flitcroft. I'm a research fish biologist with the U.S. Forest Service at the Pacific Northwest Research Station. My pronouns are she, her.
Amazing. And so the reason that I invited you here today is because I'm working with the Geological Society of America to promote a lot of the work being presented at their annual meeting, GSA Connects 2024. And that will be, it's a couple of weeks from now, but I think when this video goes up, it's like gonna be happening. So that is happening right now. And at that meeting, you are going to be presenting a project titled Recovering Resilience and Resistance to Wildfire, Learning from Native Ecosystems. And so I want to get into the details of this work, but before we do, can you just provide some background information for context about the occurrence of wildfires and why we need to increase resiliency and resistance to these fires?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So as any of us who live in the West know, the size, the intensity, and the severity of the wildfires that we're experiencing every year is increasing. And we're expecting to see that increase into the future. What folks don't always recognize is that the West is a fire-formed landscape. Fire has historically been an incredibly important disturbance process that affects our aquatic ecosystems as well as our terrestrial landscapes. So our historical context for fire in the West is that fire used to happen a lot. And we have been incredibly good at suppressing fire for the last many decades. The result in many places has been that we've accumulated fuels in places that would have burned more frequently, so that when the fires do happen now, they tend to be more intense and larger. So this mechanism of land management is intersecting with drier conditions associated with climate, making the severity of those fires even greater over time. But, so different parts of the country will have different fire severities. And so understanding what that typical fire regime and the associated characteristic wildfire for that area, which is based on historical fire, is really informative, particularly as we think about what conditions are going to be like moving into the future.
Wonderful. And so you mentioned there fire suppression and kind of this management of fires that has been our modern human practices for a while now, and how that is kind of exacerbating now the situation with increased fuel. Can you just expand on how fire suppression, which seems like it should increase our resiliency against fire, is actually decreasing our resiliency against fire, and how, ways forward on how we can manage fire a little bit better?
Well, Rachel, that is a great point for you to pick up, that what seems like it should be helping us is actually hurting us. By suppressing fire, we are making our situation a lot worse than we would have been if we had allowed fire to happen. And what I think a lot of folks don't recognize is that fire is catastrophic for people, for our human infrastructure, for our communities, our homes, but characteristic fire is not catastrophic for our native ecosystems. So our native ecosystems are adapted to characteristic wildfire. I'm being careful to say characteristic wildfire because that would be the type of fire that those areas historically have experienced. So that's the fire that's associated with those fire regimes. So some of the very large fires that we're having now that are uncharacteristic can become problematic for our ecosystems as well as for our human communities, depending on when and where they occur. So fire suppression, that land management action, which is good for people, is not necessarily good for our ecosystems and does tend to make the situation on the ground more perilous in terms of wildfire.
So you mentioned there you distinguish between the characteristic fires for certain regions versus, uncharacteristic fires. Is that distinction just based on size? So like the bigger, more mega fires we see due to our lack of control on the fuel, or is size not the only factor? Do these fires differ in other ways?
Yeah, it isn't just about the size of the fire. It's often about the severity of the fire. And so the severity of the fire can be understood and interpreted in how many trees and vegetation are killed on the landscape. A low severity fire will have minimal tree loss. That's where you have those understory fires that move through and clean out the underbrush, but don't kill the standing trees. Whereas high severity fire or stand replacing wildfire, those types of fires kill between 75 and 100% of the trees on the landscape. So that severity of the fire is probably more important than the size of the fire. If you have a very large fire that's a low severity fire, you see very quick recovery of the landscape. The forest stand is still intact. But, higher severity fires that become these crown fires, these, like I said, stand replacing fires, that's definitely something that's changing and can be problematic in places where stand replacing fire is not the typical type of fire that occurs.
So you said stand replacing a few times. I'm new to this field. What is the stand, and what does that mean?
Sure. Yeah, so that's just your forest. So it's the stand of trees that are present in your forest. And, historically, when fires moved through the landscape, they created this mosaic, right? With some areas where a lot of the trees would be killed and other areas where few of the trees would be killed. And we still see mosaics in terms of fire severity today. But then after the fire, where those trees have died, that's where you see regrowth and younger trees coming in. So you have this mosaic of ages of stands of trees that create this diverse kind of patchwork quilt of forest stands on the landscape. So when you have a stand replacing fire that's a large fire, it will wipe out that mosaic of age classes across our landscape. And then when you have fires that come in after that, there's nothing to stop the fire. It has the entire broad blanket that it can move through instead of perhaps bumping up against a stand of older trees. And very often, those older trees that were on our landscapes, they had the thickest bark. They were the most fire-resistant trees on our landscape. So when we remove those through harvest or by having fires that kill all of the stand, you lose those natural mechanisms that stop fire from moving across a very large landscape.
I've never heard that put in such a way that makes so much sense, that mosaic picture, and then it turns into this monolith of just one type that can just continue to spread because nothing changes.
That's right. There's nothing to stop it as it's going. Before you might have a young stand and it'll move really fast through a young stand, but then it'll hit a mature stand and then that can change the dynamics of the fire. But right now, when you kill everything, it's all the same.
Yeah, so that brings up another question. Well, a couple. First, we'll start with, I've seen prescribed fires or purposeful fires. What is this concept, and can this help us maintain or increase fire resiliency, or have we made that harder for ourselves now because of the way things have changed?
Another really great question. So yeah, controlled burning can be really helpful at reducing fuels. So in those places where fuel is high and where you have a lot of ignition, so a lot of lightning strikes. So you have a lot of lightning strikes at those kinds of places and a lot of fuel on the landscape. And that's what really is driving the fire regime in those locations. going through and reducing the fuels on the landscape with controlled burnings or with thinning can help reduce the severity of fires as they move through. And this is partially because you reduce not just the fuel on the ground that can burn, but also very often because fire hasn't occurred in a lot of these places, there's a lot of shrubs. And these become ladder fuels. So a shrub that burns, that's taller, has the potential to hit the branches of those big trees and for the fire to move up into the tops of those trees. So when the shrubs and the fuels are low to the ground, the fire will be more of a ground fire at the base of the trees without the flames being able to get up into the canopy of the trees themselves and then killing those trees and moving the fire through. So it can be really helpful. Controlled burns can also be a very challenging management action to take. They can be dangerous. There are some communities that have been burned up because of a controlled burn that had gone out of control. So it's complicated, but has the potential to be an enormously helpful management tool for us to use to try to reduce the fuels that are on the landscape. Fire itself is really the best mechanism for reducing fuels. So if we can do that in a controlled way, in some places, we may be better off than letting nature take its course and burning up all of those accumulated fuels without some kind of measure of control.
The other question I had on that is, I think some people might listen to this and think, okay, well, if the fire needs a stopping point or a break in all of the vegetation and fuel, does that mean that deforestation can be a good thing? I think I've gotten the question before of like, okay, deforestation is bad because we take away habitats and stuff. But when it comes to fire continuation and mega fires, can it help? Or is the way we do it not how it needs to be done for fires?
So that's an interesting question, and it's probably a global question. In different parts of the world, deforestation is often followed by localized burning to facilitate agriculture. So that type of deforestation generally includes fire. In terms of creating a block for wildfire movement, I hadn't really considered switching from forest to agriculture as possibly being a block in the movement of fire, but it's possible that it could be in some locations. It would certainly change the dynamics of the fire. In North America, many of our forested areas are deforested, if you will, in response to timber harvest. And they're not really deforested. The forests are just being cut down and harvested at different rotations. So what we're seeing now is that in some places that burn, a different forest will grow in that environment than was there before the fire. And that's because if you think about it, if we have trees that are 100 years old, they became established in a climate from 100 years ago. And so the climate that we have today is not consistent with the climate that forest needed to establish all those many decades ago. So the in some places, the composition of the fire of the forest that comes back, sometimes it's not a forest. Some of our forests are changing to shrub because it's too dry to support a forest. And so that is a form of deforestation linked to wildfire, as we see the composition of the community that can actually grow up in the current climate condition change after fire. I don't know that I fully answered your question about how deforestation could change how fire moves through the landscape, but these are just a few thoughts about how fires affect forests and how forests are changing over time.
Yeah, no, it definitely answers the question. And actually, you mentioned a little bit about agriculture, and one of my questions was, how has our use of land, whether it be agriculture, urbanization, industry, or however we're changing the land surface, how has this helped or hurt fire spread through in different locations and through time?
The evidence is pointing to an important role for land use in how fires manifest on our landscape today, both in terms of our agricultural uses, as well as our timber harvest and our management of our forests over the last many decades. So we've tended to create monocultural stands of trees in response to harvest. And so these are fairly easily fires can move through those kinds of landscapes fairly easily. We also have complications with the changing climate, particularly moisture content of our soils and the amount of time that a landscape is dry enough to really burn. That's something that's really changing. And I don't know that people think about this as much, but as our systems change, that window of time when our systems are dry enough to really burn gets wider. And so that means that you have more opportunity to have ignitions and have more fires over time. Most of our really big fires get put out by the fall rains and changing in seasons. So, what many of our fire management does, they try to put out the small fires and then try to manage the larger ones. And they're really finally put out with the change in the seasons. So as we think about that there's an enormous interaction between our land use and management and that climate and conditions that we have in any given year that allow for more fires to be able to burn.
So I just wanted to pop in here with a side note because she brought up a really good point there about drying soils and how as climate change progresses, you always hear the drier regions are becoming drier, wetter regions becoming wetter. And this, is the general average global scheme of things. However, I talk about a lot in my videos and my classes about this process called desertification. And so not only is climate change inducing the increased dryness of soils in a lot of regions, but we are also causing this process called desertification of soils in a lot of our agricultural lands. We are over-tilling and over-killing microbes, and microbes are the things that produce that top layer of soil that holds in carbon and water and makes that soil layer really rich in nutrients and moist. And when that goes away because the microbes are gone and we till it and destroy it, that soil dries out really quick in a process called desertification. And this desertification process isn't just the result of increased dryness, it also keeps causing increased dryness in that region. If on a large enough scale, desertification of agricultural lands can dry out areas and cause their climates, their regional and local climates to become drier, drying out more and more soils in the surrounding region, even regions where they might be susceptible to fires. So it's just a really interesting thing I hadn't thought of, but she, said, and my mind went off like a light bulb saying, oh my God, I forgot, desertification is in agriculture something I've talked about, but never with regards to how that might relate to and affect fire regimes. And what do you know? It does. Everything's connected. I always talk on my channel, everything's connected. So there you go. It is. So you mentioned a lot about how when fires happen and burn down a particular region of particular diversity of species, now it seems if they were really old, some newer things are growing back because climates have changed over the time that they were living there. And so you talked a little bit about the implications of that, but what are some regions where we're already seeing really pronounced changes in the types of vegetation and ecosystems that are growing back after fires? And what is the significance? What will be the effect that has on those regions?
I don't have at my fingertips the research and the maps, but I do know that the Southwest and in California are where we're seeing some of these transitions from forest to shrub-based communities. And so that's one place that we're starting to see those changes. And there's a lot of discussion here about replanting after fire, and the composition of the trees that you choose to replant after a fire might not be the same trees that burned, might not be the same species of trees that burned, to try to help with that transition as we anticipate seeing changes in what those climates are going to be for those forests to be able to flourish into the future. So that's an ongoing discussion that's gradually starting to shift and change. And there's all sorts of ripple effects. If your forest community changes to a shrub-based community, that affects how stable the soils are, and changing precipitation patterns and earth movements and mass movement events, even locally as we start to see shifts and conversions. There's there's ripple effects in regards to how we might experience landslides or flooding or such things in the future.
Yeah, and then there was another ripple effect you mentioned in your abstract that I was actually curious about because I don't know how this would happen, but you mentioned that water quality might actually also be affected by, the increase in intensity of wildfires. So how is water quality affected and what are the implications of this?
Yeah, I don't think many people realize that forests are the primary headwater and watersheds of municipal water supplies for most of the United States. So at least 50% of the water that people consume in their homes across the country originated in forested watersheds. So when those forested watersheds burn, there can be fine material that is washed off of those watersheds, and that can have the potential to foul treatment facilities and complicate how we process the water to make it drinkable for all of us. So even if you live in a city that's a long way from a forest and you don't think about a forest, that water that you're drinking very often comes from forested watersheds. So thinking about how we can make our communities more resilient with how they treat the water that's coming to them after wildfire is really important. And, I would point out too that very often folks assume that fires are going to be catastrophic for our aquatic ecosystems. So I'm a fish biologist. I've worked quite a lot trying to understand these relationships between wildfire and aquatic ecosystems, their habitats, and the organisms that live in them. And what's important for us to recognize is that the landslides that we often see after fire contribute really important sediments and large material that creates the complex habitat that our ecosystems need. So if we don't have fires, and we've suppressed fire for a long time in many places, for many of our aquatic ecosystems, the suppression of fire is a disturbance mechanism because they haven't gotten the inputs of coarse material and sediments. That said, there are some places where, we have aquatic ecosystems that are so fragmented with populations that are so vulnerable that they can't persist in response to the types of landslides and disturbance and sediments that you would expect to see after a fire.
Wow, I never thought about that. I talk about so often biogeochemical cycling and how important nutrient cycling is for marine ecosystems or other aquatic ecosystems, but I never thought about fire-caused landslides and stuff. That makes so much sense, and that is so important. So we are, if we suppress it, we're disrupting that. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how, essentially the mosaic is gone. It's this huge monolith thing. But based on all of your research and your findings, what can be done to our ecosystems and communities to make them more resilient to fire? What are some of the action items that are coming out of your research?
That's a really great question and a really important one. When we look to our native ecosystems, our native species, particularly in response to disturbances like wildfire, what we often see that brings resistance to disturbance is diversity. And diversity in habitats that can be used, in life histories of organisms. This diversity, I think, is a really important key thing for people to be able to think about. Some of our most resilient municipal infrastructure facilities have different water sources. So if the groundwater, it has become highly turbid from fire, they have another water source. So there's diversity in the sources of water that you might be able to use, even if that secondary source only allows you, to have a secondary source for a week or something. That might be enough time for your main river water source to have cleared. For our communities to be resilient to fire, we need to have multiple roads to allow people to get out of places that are going to burn. Some of our smaller communities are not designed to think about egress in case of an emergency. And so you have folks that can be isolated and can't get out of places. So diverse entries and exits to our communities are really important. And, when we start to think about how we build our homes in the West, which is this fire-dependent, fire-formed landscape, how we build our homes, like, do we have fireproof roofs on our homes? Do we have defensible space around our homes? Are we placing homes isolated in a forest, making them very vulnerable to being burnt up in a fire? So there are things that we can think about. And I think a lot of this gets back to how our native species and our native ecosystems are able to take advantage of fire. So if we can work better to make our communities more resistant to fire, we'll be more resilient as our communities grow within the West, because the West is definitely growing, our population is increasing. So these concerns about how we live here are important. And I do think one of the biggest messages we can take from our native ecosystems is diversity.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you mentioned diversity. It sounds like, that obviously, but not just in, the ecosystem and what the stands and what we're planting, like the mosaic we were talking about, but also in urban planning and exits and all of these things. I think that makes a lot of sense and is really important. So how will working toward increasing our fire resistance and resiliency in our communities and environments, how will this and all that it encompasses, so urban planning, diversity, and prescribed fires, whatever that looks like, how will that affect climate change? We often hear fires and climate change used in news media as, very related, but we know it's more complex than that. But what ways will increasing or trying to increase our resiliency against fire affect climate change?
Gosh, that is a great question. I don't know. I think that would be something that would be interesting to look at. I bet there's folks out there who are studying that. I'm just not one of them. I'm not really familiar with that literature to be able to say.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I was actually talking to Dr. Pine earlier today, and he was mentioning how, he's all for climate activism, but sometimes that gets turned into this very simplified view of plant more trees. But he was saying how he would hope that people will look into, okay, well, what kind of trees where are we adding fuel? Let's think about this before we go and just add more trees. Because, like we've talked about this whole discussion, there's details and nuances in the different species, the diversity, and how the landscape is shaped and formed and all of this. So I think obviously there's no one answer of how will our management of the land affect climate. It's going to affect it in many different ways. But yeah, I was just curious if you had looked into that at all. But
no, it's a great question. And I would look into it more in terms of how can we make our ecosystems more resilient to climate change, like a slightly different way of thinking about it. Like, how can we best represent the diversity of our ecosystems and maintain the diversity of our ecosystems to be able to be resistant and resilient themselves to a changing climate? And I think that there's an important role for management there in preserving the diverse native ecosystems that we have and maintaining the capacity of those systems to be able to persist into the future by doing process-based restoration, working with groups doing floodplain restoration, trying to restore the processes that allow us to have diverse and resistant ecosystems. That's going to be incredibly important for us as our landscapes and our ecosystems change into the future.
Yeah, I have to completely agree with that. I talk a lot on my channel about how increasing diversity of, whether it be, soil ecosystems to increase the diversity of the microbes. Because a big problem is with monoculture, you get, one type or no types of microbes. But if you increase the diversity of the crops you're planting, you get a diversity of microbes that helps increase soil health and increase carbon sequestration and storage, and also increase the growth of those crops and lessen our need for fertilizers and stuff, which disrupt nutrient cycling. So I feel like it all comes back to that diversity factor you've harped on, and that is so important, I think, for increasing resiliency not just against fire, but also climate change. And just, obviously it's just the answer for resiliency is diversity.
The one other thing I would add on that's really interesting is that there's a hypothesis out there right now that pyrodiversity, so the diversity of fires, links to biodiversity. So, as I say that as a hypothesis because there's been some really nice theoretical papers talking about this link between pyrodiversity and biodiversity, and I think that's something that we can keep in mind and think through as we look at studies and look at the results of our work in terms of the biodiversity that we see after fire.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so just to finish up with a last question, and that is kind of what is next for this research? Have we figured it all out? We know what to implement. We just need to do that? Or is there a lot of remaining questions that we still don't know?
There are a lot of remaining questions, and I think that's partially because we're asking questions at a time of change. So a lot of our baseline conditions, what we look back at as this is how these systems function and operated, might have been from research that was done 20 or 30 years ago, but our climate has already been changing for longer than that. So we don't really have those baseline conditions. We can talk about trends and how systems are changing, but how that's going to manifest and what that's going to look like on our landscapes is harder to predict and to understand. So, and there's I work a lot in aquatic ecosystems where all of our research is opportunistic. There's very little applied aquatic science where we deliberately burn riparian areas, right? This is not what is done. So trying to understand the effects of fire on aquatic ecosystems and downstream effects is definitely an area of growth. There's certainly more room to understand some of these mechanisms. And I'd also add there's some really interesting new work that I'm getting very excited about that's looking at compound hazards. So how does fire interact with whether you had a whole series of years that you had droughts, right? So a fire that's interacting with a drought is likely going to manifest differently than a fire that's coming in after a very wet season or series of years. How does fire interact with post-fire precipitation patterns? So fires that are followed by floods will likely have a very different signal in terms of landsliding and other types of effects than you might have with fires that aren't followed by events. So these compound events and different hazards, how do these come together and how can we understand those? When we think about the bushfires in Australia from a few years ago, those were like the worst case scenario. There'd been multiple years of drought, the most extensive wildfires they'd ever seen, and then torrential rain and extensive flooding. So the effect of the fire was that's like the worst case scenario. But very often our fires have pieces of that rather than all three of them coming together. So how do we think about that? The bottom line is that really all fires are not created equal, and they're contextualized within this set of environmental conditions that are localized and reflected by weather over time.
So still a lot to discover, growing field. I'm so glad we got your perspective on this because I think, like you mentioned, there's such diversity when it comes to studying fire. And I love that you're coming from it from a more, biological, aquatic, perspective, because people tend to think fire, that's just terrestrial, but it affects the other systems. So I just loved hearing this perspective, and thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to chat with you today. I've really enjoyed it.
So I hope you guys enjoyed this discussion. I know I did. Rebecca was so great to talk to. I feel like a light bulb went off in my brain every time she answered something. I was like, oh, I never thought about that. I don't know. There were just so many cool light bulb moments in this video. And as she mentioned, there's still so many unanswered questions. So if this is something you want to go into, I highly recommend. Anyway, I, can rave about this all day. But if you want to check out another video interview that I did about fire with another fire expert, more about kind of the history of fire through time, not just human time scales, but like geologic time and why Earth is so unique in its, ability to host and foster fire, and how that shaped Earth through time. I talked to Dr. Stephen Pine, another amazing fire expert, on GSA's GeoSociety channel. So I will link that video up here for you. And with that, I'll see you guys in my next one. Bye.